It's a great pleasure to introduce the third annual YTL lecture, which will be delivered this evening by Professor Richard Tuck, who is the Frank G. Thompson Professor of Government at Harvard University and an eminent historian of political thought. Although based at Harvard, he is, of course, British. He taught at Cambridge in this country for over 2 decades before moving to Cambridge, Massachusetts. In fact, he's been described as the most successful British export to America since the Beatles. Remember them? Among his greatest hits are books such as Natural Rights Theories, Their Origin and Development, published in 1979, Philosophy and Government, 1572 to 1651, published in 1993, Free Riding, published in 2008, and most recently, his Seeley Lectures, The Sleeping Sovereign, The Invention of Modern Democracy, published in 2016, which is a very illuminating study of the historical distinction between sovereignty and government, a distinction that has great significance for understanding what democracy can be in contemporary circumstances that are so far removed from those of classical Athens. In addition to his outstanding scholarly achievements, Professor Tuck is also admirable in at least one other way. He is a rare example of an academic who brings high standards of clarity and intellectual rigor to engaging with urgent political challenges of our day. The particular challenge, or opportunity, in this case, is Brexit, where Professor Tuck has been a powerful voice, along with his occasional co-author, Chris Bickerton at Cambridge, in articulating a left-wing case for Brexit, and in this way filling a role in our public discourse that used to be occupied by leading figures in the Labour Party. So, for all these reasons and more, I'm truly delighted to invite Professor Tuck to deliver his lecture tonight, which is entitled Active and Passive Citizens.
Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you to the Centre in general for giving me the honour of this invitation. I hadn't realised that I was only the third in line, and I'm somewhat abashed by the company I'm keeping, but anyway, thank you very much. I'm extremely honoured, and thank you all for coming to this lecture. It has become a truism to say that democracy is in crisis in the Western world. But the precise character of the crisis, I think, is usually misunderstood. I think we should begin with the extraordinary discovery that Yasha Monk, formerly my student at Harvard, and Roberto Stefan Foer have made, that in all the long-standing Western democracies, there is a very precise correlation between the age of respondents in opinion polls and the degree of their commitment to democracy. Apparently, about 75% of those born in the 1930s, and this is true across, Sweden, Australia, Britain, whatever, US. About 75% of those born in the 1930s believe that it is essential to live in a democracy, but this falls steadily to little more than 25% of those born in the 1980s. Unless this be thought to be a relatively trivial question, the same is true of the answer which people gave to the question of whether a military takeover would be legitimate. Again, the older respondents were strongly opposed, and the younger ones were far less so. Now, the response of some other political scientists to Monk and Foer's findings was to say that democratic values are still flourishing because tolerance of minorities has been steadily increasing over the same period, and that indeed is documented in the same kind of opinion surveys that Yasha and Foer drew on. But this goes to the heart of the matter. It's often casually assumed that tolerance of minorities is part of democratic politics, but it can also be part of non-democratic politics, as the history of enlightened despotism in 18th century Europe illustrates. A period in European history, incidentally, I would say, with marked resemblances to our own, a society of relatively liberal values and the rule of law, but rather weak democratic control. Indeed, despotism of that kind, the old enlightened despotisms, were often defended precisely on the grounds that they did a better job of protecting minorities than full democratic government would do, the old fear of the tyranny of the majority. Entrenched rights and various kinds of strong constitutional orders, you might say, without a great deal of exaggeration, are in effect today's enlightened despotisms, since their whole point is to resist the kind of popular control which the revolutions of the late 18th century called for. And like the enlightened despotisms, they depend for their enlightenment on the personal character and beliefs of the rulers, though the rulers are now the judges in constitutional courts, hence, of course, the turmoil in the United States over the character of Supreme Court appointments. It really matters what the character and beliefs of the rulers are. Now, there are a variety of reasons for this cultural shift away from democracy, and it's hard to say which are fundamental and which are, to a degree, epiphenomenal. At one level, I think, it's the consequence of quite basic facts about the kinds of societies we now live in. By the middle of the 19th century, and even more by the beginning of the 20th, it was clear to the citizens of modern states that they needed the help of even the poorest of their fellow citizens in constructing the conditions of their common life. The help ranged from the manufacture of much of what they consumed, on a scale far beyond the localized production of the pre-industrial world, to, at its extreme, the creation of the great citizen armies of the 20th century, which quite literally, in many instances, saved the lives of even the richest and most powerful members of those states, and in which the ruling class and the working class, to a significant extent, fought side by side. The recognition that these citizens had to be given a serious voice in what happened to their countries was not based on some vague humanitarian principle. It was based on a concrete understanding of what mass action on the part of the citizens had achieved and, it was thought, would continue to achieve. It's no coincidence, clearly, that the great advances in democratic politics tended to take place after the wars of these citizen armies. In Britain, as we know, all adult males finally achieved the vote only in 1918, at the same time as suffrage began to be extended to women, though, of course, as we know, still with a property qualification. And similarly, after 1945, I would say, the practical implications of democratic politics were worked out for the first time with the policies of the Attlee government, the practical implications in Britain, that is. Worth remembering, incidentally, that I think both Attlee and Greenwood were elected first to Parliament before universal suffrage, if you mean by universal suffrage 1928. So it's a very recent thing for the Attlee government. But the scale of the transformation wrought by the mass armies of industrial workers induced, I think, something of the same response. It's not merely a question of war. Such a crucial population could not be kept in a form of subjection indefinitely. One can go from old movies of the Ford plant in Dearborn, Michigan, before the war, to movies of the armies in Europe in the Second World War and see exactly the same collective force and how it had to be respected. This sense of gratitude to one's fellow citizens was not felt as plainly in the defeated nations of Europe for obvious reasons. Indeed, after both world wars, and especially the first, the response of many in the defeated nations was likely to be suspicion of betrayal or resentment at feebleness rather than gratitude. But in Britain and the US, at least, it did sustain during the post-war period for a time a general sense of at least potential collaboration between the ruling class and the working class, manifested in such things as the acceptance of powerful unions and a reasonable balance between the rewards of labour and those of capital, the kind of thing traced in Thomas Piketty's famous book. The high watermark of those years was the securing of the vote, effectively, for the African Americans of the South, though in retrospect it may be that that was almost the final act of this moment. And in the defeated nations, above all Germany itself after the Second World War, the sheer scale of the work involved in rebuilding their shattered societies also brought home to many the necessity of relying on all their fellow citizens if they were to succeed in the rebuilding. This, more than anything else, sustained Piketty's Trente Glorieuses. The central problem of Western societies now, however, and the septicemia which you might say has invaded the organs of the democracies, is that the concrete benefits which mass action used to deliver are no longer necessary. The history of the citizen army is very revealing. The last mass citizen army which Western societies, other than Israel, which is obviously a very special and unrepresentative case, I think will ever have seen was the army which fought the Vietnam War. And far from feeling gratitude to it, the American ruling class was terrified by its near mutinous response to a plainly unjust war, though this was exactly what the old theorists of citizen armies, from Machiavelli onwards, took to be their point. Never again will there be an American army, I think it's safe to say, of the old type, And instead, we have a relatively small group of expert soldiers and a set of geeks playing deadly video games in a bunker in Iowa. A kind of windy rhetoric in American public discourse about the military mimics the genuine feelings people once had, but it cannot disguise for very long the transformation in what the military represents. The same is true of industrial power. People in America and Britain now owe very little concretely to one another's efforts. What they consume either comes to a far greater extent than 60 years ago from overseas, or if made in their own countries, it's made with minuscule workforces, and even then often by an immigrant population without the vote. 100,000 workers in their pre-war heyday manned the old Ford lines at Dearborn. Now there are 6,000. And as robots take over yet more production, the numbers of people in productive employment are clearly going to fall even more. The result of all this has been the creation of what Guy Standing has termed the precariat, or what the pseudonymous blogger Anne Amnesia, I don't know who she is, has more vividly and accurately termed the unnecessariat. A very striking term. And one striking consequence of this shift has been a subtle change in political rhetoric. Many politicians on the left now routinely describe themselves as having gone into politics to help their fellow citizens. Thus, Hillary Clinton said during the 2016 campaign that she was in the race to make life better for children and families. This was the same speech in which she said, equally revealingly, when it comes to public service, I'm better at the service part than the public part. Listening to this kind of politician, one often feels they think of the state as something like the armed wing of Oxfam. But charity is not a strong enough principle to sustain genuine democracy. Apart from anything else, as a long tradition from the ancient world to the 18th century recognized, the recipients of charity can come to hate their benefactors, since the acts of benevolence merely reveal ever more clearly the power differential between the people concerned. The modern dilemma faced particularly by politicians on the left is that if they put themselves forward primarily as representing their electorate, they feel a sense of guilt, since their electorate's interests may clash with those of other people whose interests they think ought also to be taken into account. And the politicians find themselves inevitably moving into a position of rulership in which they stand above the people they represent. This situation has not been helped by the widespread assumption that Burke was self-evidently right when he argued that electors choose people who will use their own judgment on political issues. Though we should always remember that the mandation he was arguing against had been extremely widespread in the borough constituencies of pre-1832 England, indeed even in some county elections, and that the response of his audience, when he acted on the basis of his principles, was to chuck him out at the next election. One shouldn't forget, incidentally, that Bristol, the city of Bristol, had one of the most democratic franchises in the country, because, of course, pre-1832, the boroughs all vary in their franchise. Another significant social change, again experienced across the Western world, has been the decline in the experience of upward social mobility on the part of large numbers of people. As John Goldthorpe in particular has emphasized, significant numbers moved from the working class into the salariat, is what he calls it, in what has been called the golden age of social mobility in the middle decades of the 20th century. This was largely the result of structural changes in class patterns, with the creation of new kinds of white-collar jobs and the decline of old working-class occupations. But it was a one-off event and has largely come to an end. Men especially are now more likely to be downwardly mobile than upwardly mobile, according to Goldthorpe. This has had insidious psychological effects. Middle-class people in the mid-20th century were quite likely to have had working-class parents or siblings, and they wouldn't find them culturally alien, despite the novels of social dislocation which became fashionable in the 1950s, such as John Brayne's Room at the Top. This is no longer true to anything like the same degree, and something more like the pre-Golden Age class barriers have been recreated with obvious consequences for democratic politics. Now, these social changes may in the end be the most important reasons for the decline of traditional democratic loyalties. But like all social changes, they've been experienced also as cultural or intellectual developments. This has worked itself out in a variety of ways. But what all the ways have in common, I think one can say, is that they reconcile people to the weakening of democratic political forces, while never requiring them until very recently expressly to abjure the principle of democracy. In particular, the moral force of majority decision-making, which had been so central to the old mass democracies, has been systematically undermined. And the idea that majorities are inherently tyrannical is now remarkably widespread. It's even an idea which is frequently attributed to the founders of the American Republic, despite the fact that, as I try to show in my Sleeping Sovereign book that John referred to, the founders were in reality much more concerned with resisting the rule of a minority, since that was actually what they had experienced and what they wanted to throw off. And they'd pick up all the standard 18th century Whig writing about the corrupt parliament dominated by a minority. When they addressed the problems of majority rule, they almost invariably did so in the full awareness that in the end political decisions had to be made by a majority of the population. And even the supermajorities which they built into their system seem usually to have been seen as principally designed to eliminate what one might think of as noise, the fact that in any election a certain number of votes may have been cast frivolously and should not really be counted as part of the majority will of the society, to use the Rousseauian term. Now, during the last 60 years or so, there have been a whole series of different political theories, all of which have served in various ways to diminish majoritarianism and the significance of the vote as a means of taking decisions. The first and most institutionally powerful is the defense of a body of entrenched rights, which in extreme cases represented by the German constitution, but also some other Western European constitutions and arguably the Indian constitution now, are immune to any kind of democratic alteration. In practice, this is also very largely the case in the United States, given the tremendous difficulty now in amending the federal constitution, though this was not at all the original intention of the founders. Sometimes connected to this is the theory of deliberative democracy, in which the process of deliberation, what Rawls called public reason, is seen as conferring authority on the final decision. The actual site of decision may still be a vote, but it can also be a judicial body. Rawls, for example, famously suggested no institutional correlate for his theory other than the Supreme Court. More recently, another check has become fashionable, at least among political theorists, though it's not yet been given any concrete expression in practice, I think. This is the idea that a lottery, sortition, should be used in many instances where we would otherwise use voting. The advocates for this often use ancient Athens as their model, where sortition was used extensively in choosing officials, though it was always alongside majority voting on other matters. The advocates do not use Rome, though Rome was much closer in character to our mass democracies, since at Rome, sortition was only used, as it still is in our societies, to choose juries. Otherwise, everything was decided by majority voting, though often of a rather complex kind. We still live more or less in political societies of the Roman type, and the oldest of our institutions to use majority voting to make decisions, the Catholic Church, traces its institutional origins straightforwardly back to its origins in Rome. As you know, I imagine the Pope is technically elected by the clergy of the city of Rome, who are now all the cardinals. And there's often, but not invariably, been a supermajority requirement. I discovered while looking into all this interesting contrast. The Pope of the Coptic Church, because there are two popes, one is the Pope of the Catholic Church, the other is the Pope of the Coptic Church, is elected or chosen by sortition. Three names are put in a chalice on the altar, and a boy is led up and takes one of the names out. So the Coptic Church is still, in this sense, Greek. It's using sortition in one of the great Hellenistic countries. Rome is majority. I think, incidentally, this is something I'm getting more interested in. What you might call the anthropology of voting is an extraordinarily interesting subject and not at all well studied. Where voting was used, doesn't seem to have been used in ancient China, barely used in ancient India, doesn't appear in the Old Testament, etc., etc. This is an area which I think people have not yet thought about. As I said, sortition is defended on the grounds that, unlike majoritarianism, it gives everyone an equal chance to have their views implemented. And it is seen as democratic, since equality must be the fundamental principle of a democracy. Aristotle observed that election is an aristocratic principle, precisely on these grounds. While the different idea, though with somewhat similar consequences, is that we should take opinion polling more seriously as a basis for responsive legislation. This is beginning to be argued. Now, views can then be represented accurately, or fairly accurately, without any vote being necessary. The most recent alternative to majoritarian democracy which has been suggested, is more surprising. It's a return to epistocracy, the rule of a well-informed elite. In the modern West, this has had an intermittent history, possibly including Walter Lippmann, and it's recently been defended quite explicitly by Jason Brennan. While in China, it's been urged for some time by writers in the so-called Neo-Confucian tradition. Because of the increasing power and influence of China, this may one day be the most formidable of these anti-democratic theories. But at the moment, it probably has less traction in theoretical discussions, at least in the West, than the others. The one flourishing tradition in current democratic theory, which is committed to a form of majoritarianism, is what is usually termed the epistemic theory, according to which the point of democracy is that it produces good answers to social and political questions. The model here essentially is the observation first made by Condorcet and later confirmed by Francis Galton, that the judgments of a large number of people about something, Condorcet's example was a jury, Galton's guessing the weight of an ox at a country fair, tend to cluster around the correct answer, all other things being equal. The wisdom of crowds was a fashionable doctrine until Brexit and the election of Trump, where many of its exponents fell oddly silent. But it always had problems, chief among them in the realm of democratic theory being that it seems to preclude new votes, even on relatively trivial topics. If the authority of the decision for the citizens is its correctness, rather than the fact that they made it, then the changing character of the electorate ought to make no difference, and they wouldn't be justified in overturning their predecessor's vote. Condorcet actually does seem to believe something rather like this, where bodies of rights are concerned. Only if the changes in the electorate constitute a new question to which a new answer should be given would there be grounds to vote again, and there's no reason to think this would often be the case, or more relevantly, that we could ever determine whether it was the case or not. So even epistemic democracy, which seems on the face of it to endorse voting and majoritarianism, turns out not really to be in sympathy with the traditional ideas of democratic sovereignty and the freedom of citizens to make their own decisions, including their own mistakes. Epistemic Democrats are often called Rousseauinate, as an exponent of their view. And if it were true that the first and in many ways the greatest of modern democratic theorists was indeed an epistemic Democrat, that would be a significant support for their position. They base their use of him on a number of passages in the social contract, and in particular a well-known one in Book 4, Chapter 2. When a law is proposed in the assembly of the people, what is asked of them is not precisely whether they approve the proposition or reject it, but whether or not it conforms to the general will, which is their own. Each in giving his vote states his opinion on that question, and from the counting of the voting is taken the declaration of the general will. Bernard Groffman and Scott Feld, in a seminal article on this subject in 1988, said of this remark, "This passage in Rousseau is often misunderstood. It represents an understanding of the process of voting not as a means of combining divergent interests, but rather as a process that searches for truth." And their view has been quite widely shared. For example, David Estlin and Jeremy Waldron said in a collaborative article that Groffman and Feld's central interpretive point seems indisputable. And it's become, in my experience, a very common way to interpret Rousseau's arguments. But it's important to say that no one, as far as I can see, until the 1960s, believed anything like this about Rousseau. Brian Barry was the first person to put it forward. And fortunately, Rousseau himself made pretty clear in his Letters from the Mountain that it was not what he thought. At the end of the Letters from the Mountain, a remarkably neglected work by political theorists, actually, I think. He wrote it to the citizens of Geneva as a defense of the social contract. At the end of this work, he exclaimed to the citizens, "Above all, come together. You are ruined without resource if you remain divided. And why would you be divided when such great common interests unite you? In a word, it is less a question of deliberation here than of concord. The choice of which course you will take is not the greatest question. Were it bad in itself, take it all together. By that alone it will become the best, and you will always do what needs to be done, provided you do so in concert." And so all the passages in the social contract which seem to underpin the epistemic view can in fact be read as arguing, like this passage, that the general will constitutes the general good, The generality of the general will is what constitutes the good. It does not detect it. Any course of action which is genuinely supported by the population is ipso facto the right course of action because, on Rousseau's account of democracy, that is what the right course of action means. Rousseau's theory of democracy is in fact the closest to what I am saying, what I should be saying later in this lecture. What's to be said in general about these anti-majoritarian or anti-democratic theories, and any others which might be suggestive? The first point's a simple one, but it may be all one needs to say, actually, in practice. It is that I think it's impossible to imagine, in the circumstances of the modern world, institutions embodying principles of this kind, sortition or whatever, rights, where the institutions are not themselves the creation of something like a popular vote. We can easily envisage that a written constitution might be drafted by an assembly randomly selected from the population rather than elected, but we cannot imagine either that the assembly had not been authorized by some kind of vote, or that its draft would become law without some form of popular ratification. And again, the American experience in the 18th century simply bears that out. It was obvious to them that if they were going to construct a new constitution, it had to have some form of popular ratification. And of course, state constitutions in America, which are extremely interesting phenomena, because there, you might say, Americans are free to do what they want, since you don't have the complicated bargaining in the federal constitution. Almost all state constitutions other than Vermont, curiously, can only be changed through through a referendum. America is actually a great place for referendums. They're used much more widely in America than anywhere else, surprisingly. Sets of rights, sortition, and the rule of experts cannot be fundamental. They can only be superstructural and located at the level of what used to be called government as distinct from sovereignty, John referred to that. Constitutions which seek to lock in a set of basic principles look on the face of it, like the German one, like exceptions to this, and Norway too, the whole series. But it's not clear, to me at least, that they could be maintained in their present shape in the face of a determined and democratic move to refashion them. As in the case of referendums in Britain, such a move might be regarded as merely consultative, but as in Britain, it's likely that it would prove very hard for state structures to disregard a clear expression of the popular will. And it seems to me that the call for a second referendum just bears that out, because very few people have seriously said, just ignore the first referendum. They think we've got to replace it with the same sort of thing, and that is very striking testimony to the fact that now this is seen as almost inevitably the basis of legitimacy. However, the fundamental level, the level of popular voting on a constitution, is not all that matters. And in practice, most important debate focuses on questions of government, again, to use this sort of structural distinction. When the respondents to Monk and Foer's questionnaires said that they were not interested in democracy, they probably didn't mean that they didn't want democratic voting on constitutions. It's probable they meant something like the constraining of majorities by bodies of rights, in other words, democracy limiting itself. Now, it should be said the obviousness of majoritarianism at a foundational level puts the burden of argument on its opponents even at the governmental level. Since it's not immediately clear why, if it's necessary for fundamental decisions, it shouldn't be used for less important decisions. Nevertheless, the case for entrenched rights, deliberative democracy, sortition, and perhaps even the case for epistocracy all have to be taken very seriously. Now, what they all have in common, I think, might be described as a denial of the relevance of agency in political life. By agency, I mean the idea that when I act politically, and in particular when I vote, I am actually effecting something. One of the reasons why this idea has been marginalized is that from the 1950s onwards, political scientists took it for granted that an individual's vote, or any other contribution to a large-scale enterprise, including an army, is extremely unlikely to make any difference to the outcome. The classic illustration of this is the so-called pivotal voter theory, according to which a rational agent would only vote for instrumental reasons if the chances of their being pivotal, that is, that it was their vote which turned the election, were reasonably high. In normal elections, of course, this condition is virtually never met, and the natural conclusion to draw is, if they're acting rationally, voters must intend something else by voting than actually to bring about a desired outcome. The favourite candidate among my empiricist political science colleagues for what this intention might be is that it's an intention to express themselves. And there's a whole literature on expressive voting. But what's striking about that explanation, however, is that it puts the act of voting into the same category as other kinds of self-expression, such as carrying banners, etc., and so downgrades the distinctive character of majoritarian democracy. The outcome of the vote, on this account, has a rather loose relationship to the actions of the voters. They go into their voting booths and deliver their votes in secret, but they also ideally put up posters, march, and so on. And these are all equally expressive acts, with the same lack of causal connection with the result of the ballot. Indeed, the secret ballot may be seen as less expressive and worthwhile than other forms of political action because it's secret. It's an odd expression, to do something in secret. And some years ago, I published a book in which I explored these issues. This is the free riding book John referred to. What I argued there was that there's an implicit assumption in this account of voting which needs to be brought out and scrutinized. The assumption is that the only situation in which I have an instrumental reason for voting is one where my vote is necessary to achieve the outcome I desire. But in fact, it's also possible for me to have an instrumental reason if my vote is sufficient. Though in that situation, I have to have the further or meta desire that it should be I who is bringing about the result. This sounds a little subtle and complex, but it can be understood fairly easily through the example of a serial vote, in which one after another we step up to vote for one or two candidates or legislative measures. At some point, there will be a majority for a candidate. And we can imagine that we stop counting the votes at that point. Roman elections actually were rather like that. The last voter's vote decided the election. And so, we can say, he certainly had an instrumental reason for casting his ballot. And by the same token, all the earlier voters who cast their ballots for the winning candidate can pride themselves on equally contributing to the outcome. Each vote was decisive, conditional upon the other votes being cast. But supposing there were a lot of voters still in line waiting to vote when the ballot was stopped, many of them would have voted for the winning candidate. So if the last voter had not bothered to turn up, the result would have been the same. His vote wasn't pivotal in the sense of being necessary to secure the outcome, but it was sufficient. And if he wanted to be someone who actually made a difference to the result, he could do so by voting. Though if he did not want to be that kind of person, he had no particular reason to vote, even though he wanted the outcome of the ballot. In other words, he could choose to be an agent and act in order to secure his goal, or he could choose merely to be a passive recipient of it. Serial voting of this kind is very rare in practice, at least in our societies. But the underlying logic is the same in an ordinary vote like a British general election. It can be quite vividly experienced in the British system. Many of us have watched the count in a constituency and seen the paper ballots piling up for each candidate. At some point in the evening, it can become clear that enough ballots for one of them have been counted to guarantee that that candidate has won. If my ballot is in that pile, I can feel just like the voter in the serial vote. My piece of paper is part of the sufficient set of ballots. If it's not yet been counted, I won't be able to feel quite like that. But if I have voted for a winning candidate, the chance that my ballot is part of the sufficient or effective set in a two-person race must, by definition, be more than 50%. This is a vivid example, but the same reasoning applies even in an American-style election with voting machines. If there are enough people who vote like me, I can think of myself as having a high probability of contributing effectively to an electoral outcome. This is the point which has been overlooked in the modern theory of voting. Implicit in the pivotal voter theory is the assumption that I will vote for the same sort of reason that I will hand over money in a market. That is, that without doing so, I will not receive the good I am paying for. And indeed, an analogy between an election and a market has been quite pervasive in the modern literature, beginning with Anthony Downs. But the analogy doesn't hold, since there is no good reason in a market for me to hand over money if I'm going to get the thing for free, whereas there is a good reason for me to vote, even if someone else will step up in my place and secure the election of my candidate. And the reason is this. It might be a matter of great importance to me in a political context that I possess some degree of agency, whereas this is not an essential feature of a market. The traditional account of democracy, found particularly in Rousseau, was that democracy has a special authority because the voters are self-legislating and are not merely receiving laws, however much the laws might be to their taste, from an alien authority. In this respect, the traditional account bears some resemblance to another modern political theory, that of republicanism or non-domination. And while I was writing this, I realized, and also Quentin, who's sitting over there, I first started thinking about democratic theory 50 years ago, when Quentin was supervising, almost 50 years to the day. And I came to realize that what I have worked my way towards is strikingly similar in a number of respects to the modern republicanism that Quentin has, of course, been a famous advocate for. Because the crucial issue for the Republicans is non-domination, in which the critical issue is that my fate should not be in the hands of another person, however benevolent and concerned with my interests that person might be. The difference, and this is something which Philip Pettit and I have often argued about, is that on some versions of republicanism, a majority vote can also be thought to threaten my freedom. But there is some sense in which this idea that I want to be self-legislating applies in a way to both political theories. The market is not a domain of self-legislation. It's not a domain of legislation of any kind. And to treat democratic politics as if they're like market relations is immediately to drain them of this kind of agency. Majoritarianism arises very naturally on what you might call an agentive view. On the one hand, if a vote required unanimity, then clearly there would be very few times that any collective action could actually be agreed upon. Each time it was, I would indeed have taken a full part in determining the result, but because there would be so few occasions on which we could do anything, my overall agency, my capacity to transform the world in some way, would not be very great. And on the other, if a minority regularly got its way, then by definition any particular member of the community would be likely to have less agency than if the decision was taken in accordance with the wishes of the majority. Supermajorities on this account are a matter of judgment. To require a supermajority is to render the proposed course of action less likely, but it does ensure that a larger group of people support the proposal. In general, however, there is a good reason to support a straight majority as a decision procedure, perhaps especially on important matters. A population which thinks that the status quo is unduly privileged, which is of course the consequence of insisting on supermajorities, and that a minority of the population can block urgent change, may come to feel a general hostility to their political institutions. The experience of America with regard to its constitutional constraint, such as the difficulty in overturning the Citizens United judgment, is not reassuring. Political scientists have often been puzzled by the so-called bandwagon effect. But on this account, it's entirely rational, given, as I said, my desire to take part, to join a bandwagon which corresponds more or less to what I want. This is the natural origin of political parties, which so many modern political theorists treat with a kind of high-handed disdain, though there are some very notable exceptions. Furthermore, if my vote is a means of doing things, and not merely a way of expressing a preference, it makes sense to think about bargaining with it, or forming coalitions with other voters who may want different things from me. Again, we must assume that I want to be effective in some way and don't need to be, but with that caveat, I can think about different ways of being effective, and some of those ways may not simply be voting for what I want. If it's possible for us to think of our vote as having an effect, it must be possible for us to think strategically about it. So a stark contrast between getting what I want and failing to get it may be misleading. There will almost always be new possibilities for me to get some of what I want if I can ally in some way with enough of my fellow citizens. Any defeat is often likely to be temporary and provisional, a feature of democratic politics of the utmost importance. It's the temporary nature of any defeat on this sort of idealized picture, which damps down the violent passions of the losers, since they live to fight another day. Compare the politics of abortion in the US and the UK, and you see exactly the point I'm making. Now, the passions unleashed by the Brexit vote make the same point, I'm afraid, since everyone recognizes that in the end there is going to be a near permanent victory by one side or the other. But I think that has, in a sense, there's a Pandora's box was opened up when Britain went into the EU and for the first time faced a degree of semi-permanent principles which determine a wide range of policies, something which the British were not at all used to, and still, I think, on either side in the Brexit debate, not quite got their heads around, actually. People still talk as if it's all policy and you can change policy, and what the EU wants is policy rather than written into the constitution, in effect, of the EU. One way of capturing what is implied in the agentive view is that it takes democracy to be, in effect, a kind of civilized and domesticated version of a mob. And that shouldn't alarm us. Human beings, when they gather together physically, can effect great changes. It's not an accident the famous revolutionary moments are cases of mass action, such as the storming of the Bastille or the Winter Palace. And even in our own time, the major changes in world politics have been signaled by people actually meeting in large numbers and taking physical action, from the Paris streets in May '68 through the Gdansk shipyard, the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, Tiananmen Square, the Maidan and Tahrir Square. Beneath our placid democratic procedures, there is still this ancient fact. The great discovery of democracy was that people could accept a simple head count as the basis for the transformation which they might otherwise have effected through physical action and potentially violence. This should receive much more attention from the defenders of what is often called liberal democracy than it often does. Most clear cases of illiberal democracy, in fact, involve taking the vote away from minorities, either formally, through denying them citizenship, or informally, through corruption of the voting process. And this is, in a way, testimony to the fact that majoritarianism, as long as it respects the clear condition that everyone should always have the vote, is not as potentially illiberal as people often imagine. However, all this being said, it could be argued that no one who is in the minority in a vote can feel a sense of agency at all in the result. In what way was it their decision when they expressly said they wanted something else? So on that view, an agentive account couldn't justify democratic politics to the minority. The standard answer to these questions from the classic democratic theorists who wanted something like the agentive view, Rousseau above all, was that by virtue of participating in the vote, I had made the result my own. They expressed this through the stylized picture of social contract in which we unanimously agreed to be bound by majority voting. And this initial agreement implied consent to the result which we voted against, once we knew how the majority of our fellow citizens voted. Something like this was also the obvious response to Richard Wollheim's old paradox of voting. But it must be conceded that there is something unsatisfactory about this answer, at least if it's taken at face value. If some initial contract or convention to abide by a particular social decision procedure legitimates it, what is the fundamental difference between an agreement to follow the will of a majority which doesn't include me and an agreement to follow the will of, let us say, a Hobbesian monarch? Why should the fact that it's a vote which is the procedure be significant? The Hobbesian alternative is particularly challenging, given that Hobbes himself believed that the agreement to form a civil society was eo ipso an agreement to create a democracy, but that the primal democracy could convert itself into a monarchy with the same underlying legitimacy. A more modern version of the same challenge is represented by Hart's concept of law, with its argument that the fundamental rules of recognition which render political decisions legitimate are conventions rather than express collective decisions. On these kinds of view, it's impossible for every citizen to possess the kind of agency which the early democratic theorists wanted. All that many of us, if Hart was right, all of us, can have is a tacit acceptance of political procedures in which we take no real part. The outvoted minority on this account is not fundamentally different from the set of non-participants in the election. Both groups simply accept the legitimacy of a result they did not bring about. If this is true, of course, it's no surprise that people who think they will be outvoted might choose not to take part in the vote, since their relationship to the outcome would be the same in either case. To see what the difference might be, however, between a defeated minority and non-voters, let us consider first not an election of representatives, which obscures the issue a bit, but a vote within a legislative assembly. The classic democratic theorists, after all thought in these concrete terms. For Rousseau, the acts of the citizen body in Geneva took place in the annual meeting of all the citizens in the cathedral, when the governing council was elected and laws ratified. And the same was true of everything Hobbes said about democracies. So their ideas will be clearest in that kind of setting, in an assembly. The process of voting within a legislative assembly, as the early theorists realized, is indeed best understood as in reality a two-stage process, even if the two stages often, though not always, are run together. The first stage is the vote, and the second stage is the actual promulgation of the law. Since, on the classic theorist's view, everyone in the assembly was already committed to the authority of a majority vote, the second stage can be seen as unanimous. Everyone who took part in the vote believes that the final decision is in this sense theirs, even if they had originally opposed it. Condorcet used this fact as the basis for his calculation about when a law should be revisited, an interesting argument, something picked up by Jefferson writing about the US Constitution. But we would, I think, say that the decision was theirs in a way that it wasn't the decision of the rest of the population outside the legislative assembly, despite the fact this outside population might both concur with the result and have a general commitment to the legitimacy of whatever the assembly, that is in practice the majority, were to decide. Suppose, for example, the custom was that everyone in the assembly had to sign the law once the majority vote had been taken. The law would come out over their signatures and only their signatures, clearly signifying that it was the action of that particular determinate group. Exactly the same might be said once again about an actual concrete mass of people altering their physical environment, a mob tearing down the gates of the Bastille. Even those in the mob who might to some degree have unwillingly gone along with its actions were still part of it, in a way that bystanders, however much they might on the other hand approve of what the mob was doing, were not. If members of the mob who thoroughly disapproved of its actions bailed out, they would turn themselves into bystanders. But if there were those who, in the words of Rousseau, which I quoted earlier, thought that, were it bad in itself, take it all together. By that alone it will become the best, and you will always do what needs to be done, provided you do so in concert, then by virtue of staying with their comrades, they were taking part in the action. These examples are vivid because they involve what one might call imaginatively manageable numbers of people, crowds which can act together, whether in a legislative chamber or at the gates of the Bastille. And many of you must, like me, have thought, watching the recent debates in the House of Commons, and in particular the illicit photo of the MPs crammed into the lobby, that the physicality of the Commons is still a very striking feature of it. And in a sense, it's deliberate because they chose to rebuild it, on Churchill's advice after the war, after the bomb damage, too small. There aren't enough seats. And so you get this sort of physicality of the event. And of course, the acclamation. Every vote starts with acclamation. Very ancient. The same principles, however, I think apply not just to a legislative assembly, but to the electorate of a large nation. The key thought behind the 18th century invention of the plebiscite, or the referendum, in both the United States and France, was that citizens as a whole could function like a democratic assembly. That the argument which had been used since large European states emerged in the early Middle Ages, that democracy could not be practiced in modern states, since they were in general too large for all citizens to meet together, was not in fact true if one distinguished between fundamental and less fundamental decisions. Fundamental laws could be voted on in the same way and with the same frequency as representatives were sent to an assembly, and there was no technical difficulty in including the whole population in a legislative moment. But if this is the key thought, then one should correspondingly assume that the citizens in a plebiscite will behave like the members of a parliament or other assembly. And in a parliament, the authoritative moment is not the debate, but the vote. As a rule, many members do not speak. In the British Parliament, it's the fact they go through the lobbies, which is their essential act and not their contribution to the deliberation. Moreover, many representative assemblies have very little say collectively in drafting the bills which are put in front of them. Though the bulk of the members have some powers of amendment, as we are seeing, it's contentious here, essentially they often have to accept an agenda set by a small group of their fellow representatives, or even in the American system, by people completely outside the assembly. We should not expect more of a plebiscite than we do of an assembly. In each case, the decisive moment is a vote, and most citizens behave much as the representatives in an assembly do, with perhaps the added advantage that they are not whipped. Furthermore, the uniquely deliberative character of an assembly, which has always been treated as its quintessential feature, can be greatly exaggerated. And again, I think we're learning that. Rousseau, for one, believed that the decision of the citizen assembly would be best, as he said, if citizens had no communication one with another. In most states, from at least the 17th century onwards, discussions in an assembly have been only part of a much wider discussion, ranging from the technical arguments of academics and civil servants to the cruder arguments in the press and on the street. Members of an assembly stand in the same kind of relationship to these wider deliberations as do members of the general public, and their views seem to evolve in accordance with them just as those of the public do. I have never heard a debate in Parliament which was as profound or far-reaching as the debates outside it. What makes the parliamentary debate special, and even today gives it an air of drama and urgency, is that the members possess a power to make a final determination of the matters in debate, and that power is the vote. The natural implication of what I have called an agentive theory of democracy is, of course, universal suffrage. And indeed, this was what all the most obvious advocates of this kind of view were committed to. In the case of most of them, this meant first that they were willing to push for female suffrage, even when this was politically very difficult in their time. The most obvious example of this is Bentham, writing to the French in 1789 and urging that the new constitution should give the vote to women. Actually, quite a lot of people wrote to the revolutionaries. They actually sent out a request for intellectuals all over Europe to send ideas for constitutions. And according to the report, a lot of the responses said, obviously you've got to give votes to women, but the committee disregarded that. And many of them wanted an even wider franchise. Bentham again proposed 14 as the age for voting. And most strikingly of all, and something of great importance, I think, they were in general unsympathetic to a strong distinction between citizen and resident alien. Bentham argued in his plan of parliamentary reform that aliens as well as women should have the vote. Though it should be said in that work he thought there had to be some sort of tax qualification. But anyway, general principle, you can't distinguish between citizen and foreigner. There's no such thing as citizen, which is distinctive. And Rousseau, though we often forget it, thought the same. When he described the ancient government of his native city in his unfinished History of the Government of Geneva, which in the 6th letter from the mountain he described as the model for the social contract, he praised the fact that in the past new residents, as well as those born in Geneva, have been able to take part in the popular assembly. And this should not surprise us, given that the whole point of Rousseau's theory was that laws had no authority over anyone who had not in some sense made them themselves. In the social contract, voluntary residence, and this is obvious, but virtually no one points this out, in the social contract, voluntary residence is the criterion of full citizenship, not as it had been in Locke, that merely of a resident alien. I mean, Rousseau says something that looks very like Locke. You know, you, by choosing to live somewhere, you have accepted its political values and so on. But for Locke, all that does is render you under the sway of the laws made by the people who've made express consent. For Rousseau, that is what it is to be a citizen, to have voluntarily resided. And Rousseau also applauded the way the early Romans had treated foreigners at Rome as citizens. But the less they take something like the agentive view, the more likely it is for a democratic theorist to be willing to make distinctions between different kinds of residents in the same state. The most informative instance of this, from which I took the title of this lecture, is that of the great theorist of the French Revolution, or at least aspects of the French Revolution, the Abbé Sieyès. Sieyès saw the state, in a very modern way, as a mechanism created to ensure that citizens enjoyed a set of what he termed the rights of man and citizen, or, as he also called them, natural and civil rights. In a draft list of these rights, which he produced for the National Assembly in July 1789, he included such things as liberty, property, security, freedom of expression, freedom to come and go from the state, and freedom to employ one's strength, industry, and capital in whatever kind of work one might choose, unimpeded by any individual or association. But he was not willing to include a right to participate in politics in this list of fundamental rights. He went on to say, "Up to now we have dealt with the natural and civil rights of the citizens. It remains for us to consider the political rights. The difference between the two kinds of rights lies in the fact that the natural and civil rights are those for the maintenance and development of which the society is formed, their foundation. and the political rights are those by which the society forms itself. It is better, for the sake of linguistic clarity, to call the first passive rights and the second active rights. All the residents of a country ought to enjoy the rights of a passive citizen. They all have the right to the protection of their person, their property, their liberty, etc. But they do not all have the right to take an active part in the formation of public institutions, which I translated pouvoir, public pouvoir as institutions. They are not active citizens. His prime examples of passive citizens were foreigners, children, and, of course, women. Sieyès has enjoyed a resurgence of interest in the last couple of decades or so, as his constitutional theories in general seem to fit the modern world rather well. His modern admirers, of course, would not endorse his rejection of universal suffrage. But the logic of Sieyès' position remains, and it's found expression, you might say, in the kinds of democratic theory with which I began. Sieyès' passive citizens were always accorded both legal rights, other than the vote, and the right to participate in other ways in politics. They could petition and do everything which the active citizen could do other than elect. But under a system of sortition, or some other current democratic theories, this is no more than all of us would do. In effect, much modern democratic theory has exactly reversed the 19th century process. And instead of making passive citizens active, it has made active citizens passive. And one of the most interesting and politically important aspects of this is illustrated by the debate in most Western countries about immigration. Modern economies depend almost as much as 19th century ones on a labouring class without the vote, though the new disenfranchised class are immigrants rather than poor native-born residents. From the point of view I've been describing, as Rousseau and Bentham recognized, this is intolerable. They are under laws they did not themselves make. But from the Sieyèsian point of view, there's no acute problem, since their fundamental rights are secured, and the vote is a subsidiary and practical matter. The practical question to ask, if what I've been saying is right, is, and I think it's a question that very few people have asked, what would an immigration policy look like if we understood that all immigrants were like the Irish are currently vis-à-vis the UK? That is, they could vote as soon as they had established a normal residency in a constituency. How far do many liberal approaches to immigration rest implicitly on a distinction between the immigrant and the citizen? What would a policy of open borders plus immediate citizenship look like? And how many people, and more relevantly, how many companies employing immigrant labour would in fact support it? I'm not sure that I myself have an answer to any of these questions. I've only recently begun to think about them. But they illustrate the kinds of issues which are opened up once we begin to think of politics as quintessentially a domain of democratic action. So, thank you.